Hi, my name is Sam, and for my project I'm covering the Acids, Bases, and Electrolytes chapter in Anatomy 2. Now, some things that I would like to cover is body water content. In babies, the body water content is 73%, but as people grow up, in young men perhaps, it drops to around 60% and 50% in young women. And then as our bodies age and we get a lot older, it becomes around 45% in the elderly and seniors. Special fluid compartments can include intracellular compartments and extracellular compartments. This is just meaning that it's water inside the cell and outside of the cell. And then we have interstitial compartments, which is just fluid that flows between the cells. The composition of these fluids include electrolytes and non-electrolytes. Electrolytes are charged particles with ionic bonds, and non-electrolytes are non-charged particles with hydrogen bonds and covalent bonds. Electrolytes can include salts, acids, and bases, and non-electrolytes can include things like glucose, fats, or lipids, and urea, a special one. And then electrolytes perhaps have a greater osmotic activity, and they make more than one particle typically. Extracellular versus intracellular fluids, the differences between the two can be things like in the plasma, extracellular have high sodium and high chloride ions, whereas they have low potassium and low hydrogen ions. And then they also have like low levels of protein as well. Intracellular versus extracellular have low sodium and low chloride ions as opposed to extracellular, which has high. And then intracellular also has high potassium and high levels of protein as well. Lastly, we have interstitial fluids, which are high in sodium and chloride ions, low in protein ions, and low in phosphate ions. Now we move on to the sodium and potassium pump. This is a pump that requires ATP, or our usual source of energy, and it moves sodium from outside of the cell to inside of the cell, and then the potassium that's already inside of the cell to the outside of the cell. So it basically just switches the ions back and forth. Something that can affect this or affect general diffusion in our body is osmolarity of the fluids. And the osmolarity of extracellular fluid directly correlates to the volume of intracellular fluid. In the capillaries, things like hydrostatic pressure, or the pressure that's pushing against the bed of the capillary, will move water in leaky capillary beds outside, and then osmotic pressure will push that fluid back in. So that's usually how fluid kind of circulates throughout the body. The relationship between interstitial and intracellular movement has to directly do with osmosis and active transport, and also facilitated diffusion. Now, osmosis is generally just how the water moves against the gradient, such as if there's a lot of salt and no water in one area and a large body of water in another, the water will generally directly go to that. And then facilitated diffusion can directly correlate to the gradient of the diffusion as well as osmolarity. And active transport just has to do with using energy, or ATP, to really facilitate its diffusion. Lastly, we have simple diffusion, which requires no ATP. This is a good example of things like water moving towards the solute, how maybe you could pour an iced tea packet into a water bottle and it will dissolve. That's simple diffusion. It doesn't require any natural energy. Next, we have the topic of where and how we take in liquids. 60% of the liquids that we take into our body we drink, and then 30% is from the food that we eat. Now the last 10%, since that totals up to 90, the last 10% is directly made in our body from combining hydrogen ions and oxygen ions together through our respiratory system. This is the last piece of how we take in liquids. Next, we have some of the most powerful mechanisms in our whole body, and that is the thirst mechanism. The thirst mechanism is a very, very powerful reflex that we have that will make our plasma levels in our blood drop by 10% and make the osmolarity of that plasma go up by 1%. This will cause our mouth to dry out, and it will send a message from our hypothalamus to the rest of our body saying that we really, really need water because it comes down to life or death at that point. Now, the different types of water output. Humans have two different types of water output. There's sensible and insensible. Sensible water output would be ways that we can sense that we're outputting the water, such as sweating, peeing, or defecating the water. Then insensible would be maybe evaporating from our lungs. It's typically called insensible because we can't sense that it is happening. Some of the clinical problems related to water intake are, one, hydration, and that is a lack thereof water in the system, and that triggers the major thirst mechanism that a lot of us will experience in our lifetime. There's hypotonic hydration, which is water intoxication. That is like when we drink too much water and our bodies get overswelled with water. The cells themselves will swell up due to the excessive volume in the extracellular space. This is because the outside of the cell is hypertonic to the inside of the cell, causing water to rush into the cell, causing the cells to swell. This can lead to things like edema or cerebral edema, which can cause death. Typical signs of edema could be nausea, vomiting, or cramps or cerebral swelling or anything like that. Other causes for edema could be maybe congestive heart failure or increased fluid in the interstitial spaces. Really anything that can cause fluid to build up in the body without having a way to get rid of it. The cause for it could maybe be too much sodium in the body, causing too much water to be intaken into the cells, causing them to swell. One of the most common minerals in the body is sodium. It plays an enormous role in osmotic pressure and regulates the release of aldosterone, which also will in turn regulate the release of angiotensin. Aldosterone is released in times where the body senses that there is a very low sodium level, and this will cause the kidneys to reuptake the sodium that it already has so that it can use what it has until we can reintake more sodium from either our diet or other ways. The condition for which the body is in low sodium levels is called hyponatremia. Now, when potassium comes into play, when there is too much potassium in the body, that can be called hypernatremia. Now, a lack of ADH or antidiuretic hormone in the system will cause us to pee away all of the potassium in our system, which is unhealthy. It will also cause us to pee away all of the sodium content in our system. The lack of aldosterone can also lead to urinating too much sodium. Now, potassium is a very important mineral in our body because it causes the action potential to start working. The action potential works in that it keeps our pH from swaying too far one way or the other, from swaying to alkalosis or acidosis. In times of acidosis, the extracellular fluid, that's the fluid on the outside of the cell, causes the potassium levels to rise. But those levels will drop during urination due to a lack of blood pressure. The cardiovascular system plays a major part in blood pressure dropping and potassium dropping. The heart has baroreceptors, which set stretching in the heart during times of high blood pressure. This will cause the heart to go into diuresis, which will alter the pressure to be normal. Calcium is another major mineral in the body because it helps with blood coagulation in times of bleeding. This will help with the thrombin in the fibrin formation, which helps keep blood pressure elevated so that the heart can keep the hydrostatic pressure of its blood vessels elevated, which in turn helps with osmotic pressure. The ANF factor is a factor that works during excess blood pressure and atrial stretching, and this will act on the kidneys and the sodium secretion decreasing and the glomerular filtration rate. And this is going to lower the blood pressure as well as increase the renal vasoconstriction. So in other words, it's going to increase the amount the kidneys can retake in terms of high blood pressure. And this will also work in inhibiting the factor renin. Renin is secreted in the kidneys and promotes the secretion of angiotensin. And angiotensin helps with the secretion of aldosterone from the adrenal glands. These all play into part almost like one big orchestra, all working at the same time. Aldosterone, that is a way that our bodies can conserve sodium when our sodium levels are very low. It's secreted and uses the sodium that is already in our body to reuptake it and use what it has before we can take in more. Angiotensin is a special protein in the blood that promotes aldosterone, as I previously stated, secreting from the cortex of the adrenal gland. This will raise blood pressure in times of low blood pressure, and this will act with sodium in the kidneys and increasing the hydrostatic pressures and osmotic pressures. Some other things that may play into blood pressure is the female sex hormones, estrogen and progesterone. Now, estrogen affects fluid retention in the fact that it increases the plasma volume. Progesterone antagonistically works with that by decreasing plasma volume, so it decreases blood pressure. Progesterone also will decrease bloating and swelling in the body. Another important factor of the acids, bases, and electrolytes chapter is the regulation of anions. Anions are special ions that recharge other ions. Now, specifically speaking in the body, these are chloride and bicarbonate. Chloride is secreted to raise the pH in times of acidosis. Now, bicarbonate is secreted to lower the pH in times of alkalosis. It is also secreted in times when the pH is at a normal level because it helps keep it at a normal level, and it also helps with the bicarbonate buffer system. Now we get into the more in-depth part of this chapter, and that is the acid-to-base balance. The acid-to-base balance is how our body balances between acidosis and alkalosis. A normal pH level for the human body is 7.45, which is just above the normal level for in between acidosis and alkalosis. So technically, our body is just a little bit more basic than acid. The human body doesn't do well during alkalosis or acidosis because during acidosis, the proteins in our body are naturally denatured. During alkalosis, the body just plainly doesn't use them as effectively. The differences between acids and bases. Acids are the proton donors, bases are the proton acceptors. Basically, acids will charge bases. Since the proton is a positively charged ion, that is why it charges the base when the acid donates it. The bicarbonate buffer system. I mentioned this earlier, but I did not get to actually fully explain it. The bicarbonate buffer system involves bicarbonate, which is secreted when the body reaches alkalosis to lower the body back down to a normal pH level. More scientifically speaking, water and carbon dioxide are combined within the body to form carbonic acid. This is naturally denatured because it's an acidosis chemical, which creates a bicarbonate ion and a hydrogen ion. This then creates a naturally reoccurring process, which in turn buffers our pH and keeps from us swaying from really far acidosis or really far into alkalosis. As a side note, carbonic acid naturally absorbs hydrogen ions. Bicarbonate ions will work antagonistically with that in lowering the pH when the body reaches alkalosis. If there are no hydrogen ions present in the blood, bicarbonate will be released and will raise the pH to create more hydrogen ions. Now, all of this takes place in the extracellular fluid of our cells, and as well as the intracellular fluid, and creates the entire buffer system to keep us from swaying into acidosis or alkalosis. The alkaline reserve is a special form of bicarbonate ions that are left in the blood for when the body reaches acidosis levels to bring the pH back up to a healthy level. The respiratory system greatly helps with maintaining our body's pH level. When we reach an acidosis type of level, we may speed up our breathing to expel more CO2 from our body so that it can raise the pH. When we reach an alkalosis level, we may slow our breathing to maintain a little bit more CO2 in our body to lower our pH down to a healthy level. Some clinical issues that can be directly related to the respiratory system and our pH level can be hypernatremia and hyponatremia. Hypernatremia can be too much CO2 in the body. Hyponatremia is too little CO2 in the body. Our kidneys also play a major role in maintaining our body's pH level by reuptaking certain minerals and chemicals to maintain a healthy pH. The renal system will reuptake certain bicarbonate ions to keep our body from going into acidosis levels. Also, it will reuptake certain plasma proteins, which will keep our blood pressure from dropping too much, and that'll help with hydrostatic pressure and in turn help with osmotic pressure. Now, when our body reaches alkalosis levels, the body will collect too many bicarb ions and expel them through the urinary system. Metabolic acid or metabolic acidosis is a simple condition in which there is too much acid in the body and our body drops below the normal healthy pH level of 7.45. Another clinical condition that we may have is respiratory acidosis. This is a buildup of CO2 in our body caused by a lack thereof breathing. This can be caused by cystic fibrosis, emphysema, or other related issues to breathing. Now, the opposing factor to that is respiratory alkalosis, which is not enough CO2 in our body. This is caused by low levels of oxygen in the body and can simply be fixed by breathing a little bit less to build up more CO2 in our body and drop our pH back down to a healthy level. Now, one condition that I have yet to explain is metabolic alkalosis. This is too high of a pH, which can be caused by an excess of hydrogen ions in our body. Metabolic alkalosis can be caused by excess vomiting due to ridding the body of the acidic bile that sits in our stomach. Now, some ways that we may fix alkalosis and acidosis is respiratory compensation. Respiratory compensation is simply when the body starts breathing more or less to drop or raise the CO2 levels in our body. If we breathe more, we expel more CO2, thus raising our pH. If we breathe less, the CO2 may build up, causing more of an acidosis condition. The final compensation that our body will naturally take over for is renal compensation. The body will naturally take up more bicarbonate ions if we're in too high of a pH, or more hydrogen ions if we're in too low of a pH. This is how we can maintain a healthy pH level. We can also maintain a healthy pH level by either peeing less or peeing more. Peeing more may cause us to lower our pH due to excess ions in the body that will be expelled to the urinary system. Peeing less could mean that we have too high of a pH, so then it will be building up the acidosis levels in our body to bring them back down to a normal level due to high pH. That's my video, guys. I hope you like it.